Very good.
Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Jeffery Degner. Hello, Jeffrey. How are you doing?
Hello, Lipton. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
So Jeffrey, tell us a little about yourself.
Yes, I'm currently an assistant professor of economics at Cornerstone University. We're a small Christian liberal arts college in Western Michigan, again, the city of Grand Rapids. And in addition to that role, I'm also finishing my PhD studies with, with leadership of Dr. Guillaume Hulsman from the University of Angers in France. And so the topic of my dissertation has to do with inflation and the family institution. And I understand that is one of the topics you'd like to discuss
Yes,
today.
all right. So we'll be discussing your articles, Family Formation, Fertility and Failure, a literature review on price increases and their impact on the family institution. The second piece is the biblical ethics of the biblical ethics of free market exchange. Now, Jeffrey, shed some light on the thought of Abraham Kuyper in relation to your first article.
In that article on the family institution, I start with Abraham Kuyper for the reason that he instructs us on what he calls the sovereign spheres that God has created. Now, of course, Kuyper is a Dutch Reformed theologian in the Protestant tradition. And so when he speaks of the cosmic order, he speaks of it in terms of God as creator. And one of the things that God has done in the universe is to create sovereign social spheres, one of which is the family institution itself. And the biblical basis for this is covered in the opening chapters of Genesis. But we have other spheres that Kuyper goes on to describe. One of those is the marketplace. And in fact, the sovereign sphere of the marketplace is given very strict and orderly rules for conduct in the Old Testament, specifically in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, where the law is laid out with respect to commercial activity. One of the key takeaways for the operation of markets in the Old Testament is that the use of what are called unequal weights and measures, or false weights and measures. These are methods of cheating in the marketplace. These are strictly prohibited by God and in God's law. And so that provides us the condemnation of unequal weights and measures, provides us with an example for the proper conduct within the market sphere. Another sphere that Kuyper goes on to describe is the sphere of civic authority. Now, the biblical passages that are most relevant to this, chapter 13, St. Paul outlines the limits of that sphere. And
Repeat what
those
chapter of
limits,
St. Paul? What chapter of St. Paul? Please repeat it. Repeat the chapter of St. Paul.
yes, that is Romans chapter 13.
Yes.
And yes, it's unfortunately, it's been a chapter that has been badly misinterpreted through the centuries, and some have taken it to mean that Christians who are behaving properly in the world will do whatever government tells it to do. And in fact, in the early stages of the Nazi regime in Germany, Hitler and his agents actually used this and convinced churchmen in the German state to go along with whatever the Nazi regime put forward as law on the basis that Christians need to obey Romans 13. Now, this is the incorrect interpretation, this interpretation of absolute unquestioned obedience, for the reason that Paul gives us the limit of government activity. Kuyper might say the limit of the government sphere. And that is that government's role is to punish actual evildoers. So if someone from a family murders someone from another family, the governing authority must step in and bring sufficient and just punishment in this case. But that is the limit, the punishment of actual evil. There is no case in the scripture and no case in Kuyper's teaching where the government is able, for example, to dictate prices in the marketplace, to set, for example, minimum wages or maximum prices on, say, housing. This is out of bounds and inappropriate for civic authorities. Now, Kuyper describes for us the consequences of these sovereign spheres or agents within these sovereign spheres overreaching into other spheres and engaging in activities that are out of their bounds. And in short, Kuyper says that whenever this happens and whoever does it invites chaos, disorder, and in fact, evil into the world to a greater degree than it otherwise would have been if these agents, children, or grandparents within the family sphere, uh, civic authorities within a governmental sphere, or buyers and sellers in a marketplace. Again, Kuyper informs us and shows us that throughout the scripture, these spheres have their proper limits and rules of conduct. And that's a very powerful Christian worldview that I think helps us to explain the chaos that we see in families when government reaches into that sphere.
All
We
right.
see the
So
chaos that ensues in our world when government reaches into the marketplace.
yeah, so
Again,
Kuiper opposed the
overstepping the bounds.
centralization of power. That's what you're saying.
Yes, very much so.
Yes,
And so
yes.
what we see in what we see in the modern day is that government is reaching very much into the family. For example, to make health decisions, to make decisions about providing extra income, even subsidizing children. It seems like a well-intentioned policy, but this has nefarious and chaotic effects within families when government overreaches its bounds.
Okay, and yes, in a private conversation, you were arguing that the government does not have the right to dictate the amount of children that parents decide to have. Please elaborate for our audience because they were not privy to this conversation.
Yes, so in the case of, let's say, child subsidies provided by the government in the United States since the 1960s in particular, the federal government has promised to subsidize the birth of additional children in the event that a father is not present. Well, this, of course, creates an incentive problem where women without husbands are, in fact, subsidized by other taxpayers in order to have more and more children, more than they would have had otherwise. Now, that's not the only problem with this sort of government overreach. The bigger problem is that the government at any level does not have the capacity or the ability to calculate what the appropriate number of children are for any family at any time. There is not enough data for the government to collect to discover the optimal number of children in a household. This is a strictly personal matter. And another thing to consider is that the parents themselves are the ones who best know how to bring flourishing into their household. For some, it means more. For some, it means fewer children. But this is an intimate form of knowledge that cannot be quantified. Now, the Austrian economists call this problem the calculation problem. It is that problem that exists where government believes it can provide a number of ideal children in a household, but this knowledge is simply outside of the reach of, of government It is an intimate knowledge that belongs to a father and mother.
All right. And Jeffrey, should the government determine how parents punish their children? Is that also an example of government overreach?
Yeah, in short, they should not. Now, of course, I understand that this is a fine line. There are, of course, cases where children are in fact abused and put in extreme danger. These are cases where in centuries past, we wouldn't think of the government intervening this way. We would actually think of extended family members making an intervention into the situation and bringing the child into a more safe environment, perhaps with other adults in the extended family. But one of the long term effects of more and more government intervention into the family is not only to disintegrate the nuclear family, but also to disintegrate the extended family and make it harder for extended family members to be involved in such situations. And so, with the removal of, say, aunts or uncles, or perhaps grandparents who are less and less um, available, less and less involved in each nuclear family, we remove the possibility that they would be the first ones to intervene in the case where a child's safety is actually endangered. Now, I do also understand that there's some debate among psychologists and child psychologists about whether corporal punishment is appropriate for children. Now, I am the father of two children, and I can tell you that with just two, we have different responses to a parent's disciplinary action or disciplinary words. So again, this brings us to this knowledge problem. A government cannot know the appropriate degree or level or type of discipline that is appropriate to bring about a child's orderly behavior. Because what is the goal of child discipline? The discipline of children often takes on a harsh connotation in our day and age. But we must remember that that word itself, discipline, is from the word disciple, which means to be a follower of certain teachings. It is someone who has been trained for appropriate behaviors as you interact with siblings, as the child interacts with their parents or other people outside of the household. And once again, this is knowledge that is unattainable for government. And so this is the reason why governments not only shouldn't intervene in how I discipline and direct the behaviors of my children, it is simply impossible for them to do so in any effective way.
But Jeffrey, this discussion is not a scientific one, but there's various studies arguing that corporal punishment can have a benefit depending on the scenario. Personally, I don't support corporal punishment. I think that children can change if they are socialized properly, and we do not need to treat them like dogs or hit them. However, corporal punishment can be allowed depending on the circumstance. There is a big difference between punishing children and abusing them. So if one decides to spank his children, that's not objectionable based on my view. But personally, I don't support punishing children via force.
Understood. And I think that this position that government is not to intervene in these matters, except again, as we've said, in the cases of actual serious physical harm, but also when it comes to this debate amongst psychologists about some of the potential costs or benefits of corporal punishment, that this is still a matter of discussion, and that in some cases it can be appropriate and helpful for children. I would be interested, I'm not an expert on this literature, but I would be interested to see if there might be some literature out there on corporal punishment when it comes to perhaps gender differences in this respect.
All
So I'm
right.
sort of wondering out loud again that's an ongoing discussion that I think each parent and each couple who has children must approach these matters uh, with agreement and with the appropriate attitude and logical, rational reasoning behind their actions towards disciplining their children.
Yes, I agree with you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, the issue of the family is very important because some argue that the family is under assault from the federal government. So for instance, Stephen Baskerville in an article published several years ago cites a judge. Your job is not to become concerned about the constitutional rights of the man that you are violating. A New Jersey divorce judge instructed his colleagues, we don't have to worry about the rights.
Mhm. Yes. So if I'm understanding the meaning of your statement, there is ongoing discussion about the rights of fathers and mothers when it comes to child custody, or when it comes to the overall rights of parents with respect to decision making regarding their children's lives. And really, I think there are two major areas of concern today when it comes to parents' rights to make decisions for their children. The first being in the realm of education, especially the primary, the young years of education. And the opponents of school choice are essentially, at their core, making the argument that the state knows best how to educate a family's children. So the educational field is one where, again, I believe by limiting or prohibiting parent choice in school collection, this is what Kuiper would call a form of government overreach. The second one that I think is of a growing concern at this very moment is parents' rights over their children's medical care. Now, I'm referring specifically to vaccination, or I should say, the use of emergency authorized mRNA gene therapies. Uh, these these shots, will they be dictated towards our children? That is a question that I think remains outstanding, and I have no doubt that there are certain politicians who would assert that, in fact, the federal government does have the right to force parents to take their children to be injected with these materials. Again, this is overreach. Um, so that I think is very much a hot topic for our current situation when it comes to the medical care of children.
Vaccines are not that tricky of an issue. Based on our genetic structure, we do know the implications of vaccine. So a vaccine that works for you may not work for someone else. And a perfect example of this is the COVID vaccine. It has worked for some people, but others have died, and some have contracted the disease after taking the vaccine. So I think that people are intelligent.
Precisely,
I think I,
precisely.
I think that people are intelligent enough to make the right choice. So I personally I don't impose vaccines on people.
Population, but even more so for the federal government to make this it would not surprise me at all if there would be federal agents, federal government officials who would say, for example, I have a child of a certain age who is about to enter college, and the government may perhaps decide that they would deny student aid to a student who has not received one of these injections. And so I am very concerned about the lengths to which government can and has the will to go to interfere in family life. I think historically I have good reason for this sort of concern, as we see totalitarian regimes throughout the ages turn children against their parents for certain attitudes, words, behaviors, and so forth. And so this needs to be a concern of citizens everywhere, regardless of what nation they happen to live in.
Yeah, totalitarians often attack the family because the family is the bulwark of freedom in a society. The family and the church are important institutions. They defend us from the tyranny of the state. And in the family, we become an individual. And if you're totalitarian, you cannot accommodate individualism. So if I were a dictator, I would wage war on the family. That makes
Yes,
perfect sense.
it absolutely does. And it's not, and you're right, it's not only the heavy-handed um, totalitarian dictators and monsters that we think of in our history. It is even true of the smaller socialist utopias, the sort of small communes that were developed by the early socialists. One of the very first things that they would attempt to do is to deconstruct families, cause children to be raised by the collective, and to dissolve marriages specifically under the pretext of quote unquote freedom or free love. Now, in nearly all cases, it was the leaders of these socialist utopias who began taking the most aggressive liberties with the former wives of other male comrades, you might say, in these communes. And so there's a long history of this in the smaller utopias of the socialists, but then of course the large scale destruction of families under the Nazi or Soviet regimes. So wherever collectivism is the rule, the family is jeopardized, whether the collectivism is on a small or a national scale.
Exactly my point. And Murray Rothbard in the book A Requiem for Marx had a chapter on early socialists and their decision to communalize family and wealth. They often shared women in common.
Mm-hmm. And another book for your viewers that I would highly recommend is by Dr. Znamensky from Memphis University. He released a book this past year called Socialism as a Secular Creed, or a secular religion, one might say. And he recounts a lot of these early socialist utopias, as well as the more commonly known nation states that adopted socialist forms of control, and one right after the other. The family institution was an early target for destruction by these regimes, both large and small.
No, we have established the Christian and secular basis for defending the family, and as a result, we can discuss your article on family formation. I guess this is what most people have been waiting to hear. So Jeffrey, is there a link between prices and the age of first marriage?
Uh, I'll answer that by looking at the empirical evidence
That's
first.
what I expect you to
And
do.
here's what we see through. Yes. But I will briefly discuss the theory because I think that's important as well. But the empirical evidence is quite clear. And one of the strongest cases is if you look at the age of first marriage in Japan. Now, we think of Japan, of course, as being a developed Western economy, and that is true. However, one of the most important prices for a young couple to come together in a marriage is the price of housing. But the question is quite simple. Can you afford to live together independently? And as housing prices have skyrocketed in Japan, at various degrees, for a young couple to come together and live as a husband and wife. The apartment prices in Tokyo are the stuff of legend in terms of their high cost. Well, if you are a young couple and you cannot afford the monthly payments in order to live together, this makes marriage formation that much more difficult. So this is a key example, not only in Japan, but in my paper, I also cite what I found to be a very interesting data set from some Iranian researchers. Now, Iran is an interesting case for the reason that we think of it as a very traditional, conservative, religious society where marriage is very important, and it is something that young people would seek out and pursue very actively. But the same trend is present in Iran, particularly in the city of Tehran itself, and housing prices in the city of Tehran over the past 20 years or so have been on a very rapid increase. And right along with that, we have seen a delay in the age of first marriage. The third empirical example I would like to bring is from the data in the United States. Now, of course, one important measure uh, of a person's standard of living is, of course, their net worth. Well, when we look at the net worth of young people in the United States, particularly those who have college loan debt, is in the negative. So they begin this time of life in their early 20s, where historically this was the time people began to get married, but with severely negative net worth, we have tracked and seen that in the United States as well, with rising prices of college and college tuition, that there is a rise in the age at first marriage. And so, what's important to remember when we think about the age of first marriage, whether you're in Japan, Iran, or the United States, is that there are in each culture certain specific, I'll call them social markers, which indicate that a young person is ready to be married. And housing is one of those things that couples throughout the world, a nearly universal reality that independent housing for a young couple is a price that matters. And if the price is too high, then you may have to wait a year or two or more in order to come together in a marriage and live together independently. So that's the empirical data from throughout the world. But simply put, from a theoretical standpoint, if independent housing is considered a part of the cost of marriage, anytime that those costs rise, it becomes less and less likely that people will be able to afford them. And furthermore, you need to take more time to save and to grow one's income in things that, again, I refer to as social markers for marriage. So that's a little bit of the empirical from throughout the world, empirical evidence from throughout the world, alongside the theoretical statement about costs and benefits.
All right, let's consider the relationship between rising prices and the impact on male criminality. Please elaborate.
Yes, so this is a complex picture, but the bottom line is that male criminality drastically reduces the marriageability of those young men. If you were to ask the average young woman on the street if they would marry someone with a criminal record, the answer is pretty universally going to be no. And that is very much a common sense sort of response, and in that way, it's not very surprising. However, there is a problem with criminality that is linked to the labor market. So, for example, if prices for the entrepreneur are rising, I'm now thinking of prices in the um, in the capital markets, the markets for the factors of production. If those prices for materials and for, let's say, rent for an entrepreneur are rising, it means that it becomes more difficult to afford labor. And in the case of male labor, if we have higher unemployment among males, particularly in the United States, we know that we have the highest rates of unemployment are among young minority males. Then what else are 16 to 24-year-olds, if they don't have jobs, they're found getting into trouble, in short. And once those young men are incarcerated or develop some kind of pattern of criminal behavior or convictions, this makes them much less marriageable. Now, I know that there might be some who would be offended by this, but it is nonetheless true. When we see young men avoid incarceration, complete their education, begin a job, and get married, that there is, in fact, what economists call a marriage premium. What that means is that if a young woman marries a young man who has met those personal markers in their lives, that they both experience an average increase in their average income. There is sort of a multiplier effect because of the household division of labor. They're able to split duties at home, which allows both, or even just one party, the husband or the wife, to spend some more time at work developing the possibility of greater promotions and greater income. So these are two very different outcomes. For those young men who fall into criminality, perhaps because of high costs of factors of production, this is a wide gap in life experience between those young men who fall into incarceration, do not get married, versus those who avoid incarceration, complete their education, get married, and then see an acceleration in their wage growth. So this is a phenomenon, or a part of a phenomenon, that the economist Charles Murray talks a bit about in his 2012 book called Coming Apart. In that book, he really details the divergent experience of family life in the United States, where we see some families flourishing due to increasing real income, and other families either never forming or disintegrating under the conditions of falling real income. And so that's a book that, again, I would recommend to anyone who's interested in family economics as a broad category.
Excellent summary of the empirical data. But we have another question for you, Jeffrey. Do prices affect the decision of a couple to have children?
This is a question that I'm continuing to work on up to this very moment. Actually, today, continuing to work on a paper where I'm trying to specify this a little bit more. And what I, at this point in my studies, have come to believe is that if you have increasing real income as a couple, you are more likely to be able to have the ideal family size. Now, ideal family size is entirely subjective to each couple, that the couples are able to more effectively plan, so that these couples will effectively use contraceptive methods, and they will have fewer abortions. I will address this as it's commonly understood as a form of contraception. I would characterize it as a more violent act, but nonetheless, these couples have fewer what is sometimes considered unwanted pregnancy. In other words, people with higher real incomes are more effective in family planning. They have fewer abortions, and they have children both in the number and in the spacing, the intervals between the years of childbirth, as compared to those folks in society who are experiencing a loss of real income, those who are in the lower socioeconomic classes. And in fact, even just this past week, I've been digging into some empirical data that shows that the effective use of contraception is less likely among the poor. It's not that they can't afford contraception, particularly in the United States. I mean, it's not a prohibitive cost to obtain effective contraception. It's just that it's used less effectively by the poor. And so among the poor, you will see a higher rate of, I'm not a big fan of the phrase, but a quote, unwanted pregnancy. And then you will also see, along with that, a much higher rate of abortions among the poor. And in fact, I saw some statistics that as of 2014, of all abortions in the United States, 65% of them occur among individuals who have income of $44,000 per year or less. 65% from $44,000 or less. And it's a strong indication. And that number has grown over the past decade or so, where again, a higher concentration, a higher incidence of abortion is occurring among the lower socioeconomic classes of the United States. And so, do prices matter? Well, when I use this phrase, rising or falling real income, prices are implied there. Prices are implied there. So among the poor, if they have stagnant wages and the price for food, for fuel, for housing is escalating, that means that they are losing real income. And in the case of the United States and other Western nations, one of the directions in which these poor families turn is once again to look to the welfare state as a solution to these economic woes.
Interesting. And Jeffrey, what is the relationship between the liberalization of divorce law and the decline of marriages?
So this is a very interesting empirical question, Lipton. I'm glad you bring it up. Um, there's a particular scholar, the last name is Wolfers.
Justin Wolfers?
Yes, sir. Yeah, Justin Wolfers, who studied that very question. So as divorce law was liberalized to be characterized as what we call no-fault divorce, it basically is a quicker, easier, cheaper way to dissolve a marriage. In the places where this has occurred, there has been an immediate and brief spike in the divorce rate, but it is not a permanent increase. So what Wolfers concluded in his work is that no-fault divorce law basically accelerates divorces among couples who already have a relationship that's, quote, on the rocks. They're already having difficulty. And with the immediate emergence of no-fault divorce, those couples that are having trouble immediately seek divorce. But the no-fault divorce law does not have a long-lasting, permanent effect on increasing divorce rates. Now, we do see increasing divorce rates in the United States in particular, mostly concentrated, once again, among the poor, those who are losing the battle against inflation, you might say. And once again, that is outlined quite nicely in Charles Murray's book, because in the upper ranks of income, divorce rates are very low. And it's sort of strange for most people to hear that, because the divorces we hear about in American society that hit the tabloids and so on and so forth are of celebrities who are rich and, oh, these spectacular divorces and settlements and so forth. It gives the false impression that the wealthy are having very high divorce rates. And the fact is that they do not. Divorce rates are much more prevalent, much higher among the lower classes. Again, those who are really bearing the brunt of positive permanent inflation. So I hope that makes sense.
I agree with you. I have studied the issue too, maybe not in depth as you have done, but it's a matter that I think is quite interesting and compelling. Rich people are likely to marry and they remain together as married couples for a long time. Poor people are more likely to divorce. This is a consistent finding in research. Yeah, so
Yes, it is. And yeah, that's and I think for some people it comes as a little bit of a surprise, but the evidence is clear that that is the case.
no, wealthy people don't practice what they preach. They're more likely to attend elite schools. They're more likely to marry.
Mhm.
They're less likely to engage in premarital sex, and they care about IQ. This is why they invest in college prep. So wealthy people
That is
reflect bourgeois
precisely
sentiment. They do not practice what they preach. They
uh,
tell poor
and
people that it's okay to
and
divorce, but they don't divorce. You may go ahead.
absolutely right. This is this is a hypocrisy that both Charles Murray and a another author who has a British author, Theodore Dalrymple.
Dalrymple, yeah.
Now, yeah, Dalrymple has documented this very clearly, and I think as strongly as Charles Murray exposes the I'll call it hypocrisy of this sort of position. I think Dalrymple is even more stark in his assessment as he looks at the liberal elites or the leftist elites in Europe, who, as you say, they advocate a sort of free sexuality, fully liberated sexual lifestyle among everyone else, but they themselves would never practice such things. They don't allow their children to practice such things. And what Dalrymple takes one step further, though, is that in decades past, the elites in society set their lifestyles forward as the type of lifestyle that everyone should aspire to. We should aspire to marital faithfulness, to children who behave in an orderly and productive way. That is the aspiration. Well, what has happened in the last, say, 60 years or so with the advent of leftist elitism in our universities and in the media and so forth is that they have begun to celebrate a, a decline in values. And there is what Dalrymple considers, he calls, oh, I'm forgetting, it was the title of a chapter in a book entitled Life at the Bottom. But it's essentially the idea that society has shifted to where there is a downward aspiration in physical appearance, in the way we dress, in the way we conduct ourselves, and so forth, so that even middle class families who you would expect to have bourgeois values are now gravitating towards these more vulgar sorts of behaviors, both sexually, in manners of dress, and these sorts of things. So Dalrymple makes a more in-depth social commentary on this problem, and it makes for very compelling reading. But it's not just compelling; it's concerning.
Yes, I call it the I call it decivilization. It's we're dignifying vulgarity and virago mentalities. That's how I would address it. It's a form. It's the rise of decivilization in Western
Yes, very.
society. But I also would like to make another
Uh,
point that's counterintuitive. Jeffrey, some years ago, the CDC showed that less educated women were more likely to be lesbians, and a more recent study has demonstrated that highly educated women, women from affluent backgrounds in the society, are less likely to identify as lesbians. They tend to identify as mostly straight. So again, there's the hypocrisy. They promote.
yeah.
You may go ahead.
Oh, yes. And I was engaged in conversation with a good friend last night with respect to lesbianism in society. And again, what you cite is correct, but it is also an issue when it comes to adoption services. There's been recent controversy in the state where I'm from. Uh, an ostensibly Christian organization called based in Grand Rapids, who handles adoptions, has recently made the decision to allow adoption uh, by gay, homosexual, or lesbian couples. Now, their argument is that, well, that's an improvement upon what these children would experience in the foster care system. However, once again, looking at actual data, if we look at the degree of, in the case of male gay couples, the degree of infidelity, it is the highest among male gay couples.
Yeah, Jeffrey,
And when it comes to, yeah,
Jeffrey, quick point. So I like
yes,
what you're saying, but soon we're going to wrap up. So I'm going to make a quick point and then I'm going to ask you some questions relating to your first study. Then we're going to discuss the biblical ethics. But I have a quick point to make. Yes, Jeffrey, many studies do show that
yes.
male homosexuals are more promiscuous. And recently I saw a study on a website to promote gay families, arguing that gay men who are in stable relationships do not oppose open relationships. So you're right.
And just real quickly on lesbian couples, in terms of the incidence of domestic violence,
Very high.
it is highest. It is actually highest among lesbian couples, not heterosexual couples. And so this idea that a child will go into a heterosexual home, a mother and a father, where, oh, there might be, domestic violence, it is much more likely to occur amongst the lesbian couple and a child to experience that.
And this is a form of cross-cultural research. So even where I'm from in
And
Jamaica,
so until we
research.
address,
Hello?
oh, yes, I have you still.
Yeah. So even where I reside in Jamaica, research shows that homosexual relationships do exhibit higher levels of intimate partner violence. So
Yes.
it is found cross culturally. But our last two questions on the family and prices. Do okay. Housing. Are renters more likely to have children or are they less likely to have children?
Yes, again, this is a question that has to do with the real income of the family. Now, in an inflationary environment, if you are a renter, if you're currently a renter, this is a problem for you. If you have, let's say, one child and you're renting a place that is relatively small and wish to obtain a home, with rising home prices, this simply becomes more difficult to have a little more, we might say, elbow room for your children. And so the rising cost of you might say, single family homes is very problematic if you're a family who is currently renting. It just makes it more difficult to obtain a home. And if the home is going to be used to expand your family size, this is a problem. Now, on the other hand, if you're a current owner of a home and the price of the home which you own is escalating and you're gaining equity at a very quick rate, well, then you may be able to sell it and find something larger, or take advantage of something like a home equity loan and add on to your house. So that increasing real wealth that is stored in one's home can make it easier to for the couple to say, okay, we are financially able to spread out a little bit and have room for another child, to add on a nursery, for example. It's a very potent reality when having children.
All right. And again, do prices predict divorces?
So once again, when we're thinking about rising prices, we're thinking about rising real income or falling real income. Now, uh, real quick, I think for most of our viewers, they're going to understand something known as the Cantillon effect.
Yes.
This is a reality in cases where there is an expanding money supply And there are winners, that is, the first receivers of the new money, versus the losers, who are the late recipients, who are dealing with higher prices on the goods which the first recipients have bid up in the first few rounds. And so that is the sort of separation of experience we're talking about here. And so when it comes to divorce, one of the spouses deciding that their life would be better if they left the marriage, well, economics plays a role in this. If they believe that they can be better off financially by leaving the marriage, well, if you have a falling real income, that may very well actually be the case. And so, once again, this is a theoretical explanation for why we see a more higher divorce rate among the poor, because in fact, it may be the case that by one of the partners leaving the marriage, they may be able to sort of spread their wings in their field of employment and be one of the gainers in society from rising real income.
All right. Yeah. So Jeffrey.
So that's. Do you still have
Okay.
me, Lipton?
Yeah, I do. I do. I'm a very patient person. So I've so far you have done well. It's just unfortunate that the internet quality in a first world country like America is just so poor. Yeah,
You're right.
that's the real disgrace. Yeah, that's the big disgrace of the day. But before we transition to your second article, the biblical ethics of free exchange, Jeffrey, you are interested in the impact of central bank and its role in inflation on the family. So just in a sentence or two, just tell us about it briefly because we have to move on soon.
Yeah, yes, very, very quickly. When central banks produce, especially fiat currency, they create wealth redistribution effects in society. I mean, some people have rising real incomes while others experience falling real incomes. And if you have a rising real income, it frankly makes it easier to conduct traditional family life, both in forming a marriage, carrying a long sentence, but that's essentially what we are arguing in this connection between
Just repeat a bit, please,
central
because
bank.
Jeffrey.
Oh, sure
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, you are missing for a bit.
Yes.
Just so
Do you
just
still have
repeat a
me?
bit, please. Yes, just repeat a bit, please. Rep-
Of course.
Yeah.
So central banks, when they create new money supply, these new monies have a redistribution effect both on income and on wealth in society. The redistribution that favors a certain group will rise or cause a rise in their real income, and those who are the late recipients of this new money supply, they experience a fall in real income. Now, when you have rising real income, it's easier to maintain family life. And when you have falling real income, it's simply more difficult. And that's a quick summary of the argument we're making.
All right, and we can implore our listeners to go and read the 2004 article published by Cherlin, the deinstitutionalization of the family. He covers that topic. Now we're going to move ahead and talk about the biblical ethics of free exchange. First question, Jeffrey, is the Bible supportive of free exchange?
Yes. So essentially, when I use that title and think about free market exchange, that is a phrase I use to contrast with interventionism and the most extreme form of interventionism, socialism. So that paper was really specifically addressed to a Christian audience, but I think even for people who are not of the Christian faith, we should recognize that socialists throughout the decades have claimed that they have the moral high ground, that their system holds the moral high ground. And I think that free market proponents have not done a very good job of explaining that it is in fact immoral. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. But the Austrians, for example, have the other explaining that the primary problem with socialism is the calculation problem, again, articulated by Ludwig von Mises. Um, Others, the folks in the Chicago School have talked about the incentive problem associated with socialism. This is also true, but nonetheless, economists have failed, I think, to identify the moral failing of socialism. And so this is where I believe theology can be helpful. And so if I take a biblical theology and begin to think about what are we studying in economics? We're studying human action, but it's important that we understand who human is. And it's my belief that the Bible provides for us a clearer picture of who man is. And mankind is that creature that is made in God's image. Now, there's two implications for this. One is that I see I see the study of theology as very much parallel in method to the way we study, the way we do economics, or what Mises calls praxeology. The method of studying theology is to start with a premise as, let's say, God is creator, and then we logically, deductively, and verbally describe the implications of that fundamental axiom. Well, similarly, in the study of economics or praxeology, we start with the fundamental, undeniable axiom that humans act, and then we logically, verbally uh, deduce economic truth, economic science from that axiom. And so, for me, these two forms of study, uh, in my experience, are very helpful to think about in terms of having similar method. Now, call themselves socialists. I would simply give them two words. Uh, the first word I would say is to remember. The second word I would say is repent. And here's what I mean by remember. We first of all must remember our theology about who mankind is. Mankind is an image bearer of God. Therefore, we can deliberate, we can choose, we can create, we can discern, we can prefer one thing to another. And this is something that each individual is, as an image bearer of God, is capable of doing. So remember that theological fact. But let's also remember historic facts. And again, Lipton, for your audience, I don't think we need to recount all of the
No, no,
historic horrors of
Jeffrey,
socialism. Yeah.
Please give specific biblical examples. So, for example, First Thessalonians verse 5. We command you, brothers and sisters, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, to keep away from every brother or sister who is idle and does not live according to the tradition received from us. Give examples to indicate that the Bible is not incompatible with economics and free markets.
Yes. So in that passage, thank you for getting me back on track, Lipton. The that passage you refer to there is very specific to this question of idleness. One thing that Paul does over and over, he says, if you're a member of the church, there are two things that you should have no association with. The two key categories. One is sexual immorality. The second is idleness. Being a burden on someone else in a financial or economic sense. Paul forbids it, and it's explicitly clear that to refrain from work and to do so at the expense of another is simply unchristian behavior. And in that sense, we would say it's an immoral behavior. And what socialism contends in its core philosophy is that it's to each according to his need. and from each according to their ability. And so this allows vast swaths of people in society to become completely idle. And as uh, people from the socialist
Yes.
countries are known to have said, we pretend to work and you pretend to pay us.
Yeah,
This is
exactly. And
idleness.
yes, and Jeffrey,
Pure and simple.
In your article, you gave a brilliant example, the story of the talents.
Yes.
Yes, and
One of the
God,
claims that so
yes, and God prefers people who work hard. That's why the productive employees were rewarded with more money. And you also stated in your article that inequality is a part of life, even in the Bible and in heaven.
yes, and that is the takeaway of the talents. I won't go into a full explanation. It's actually one of the more familiar parables. But what is so interesting in the end is that, remember, the unfaithful servant who was given one talent. Now, by the way, in our modern day equivalents, one talent is the equivalent of 600,000 US dollars.
Yes.
He was given that money to invest. This is no small amount. All right. And so, as we may be familiar with the story, that unfaithful servant
Was
buries
punished.
it out of a sense of resentment, and they were punished. And that $600,000 was taken from him. And very interesting, most people don't catch this. The master gives it all to the most faithful servant, the one who had already acquired the modern day equivalent
Exactly.
of, I believe, $6 million.
Yes.
And so this is an encouragement to all people to exercise their gifts and their abilities to the best of their ability, and not only in a temporal sense, but in a heavenly sense. There are rewards in heaven.
Yes,
And for
and
our
Jeffrey.
Christian listeners, there is an inequality of reward.
Yes, and
And this is
Jeffrey.
shocking to some of my students.
Yeah, Jeffrey, productive people are rewarded. In other words, talented people are appointed to higher levels because of their productivity.
Yes.
All right. So, Jeffrey, we had a very interesting conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap it up.
Okay.
It's just
Well,
really continue. Please go ahead.
oh, I just wanted to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, and it was a joy to talk on these things. I wish you all the best and blessings in everything you do.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate that America is declining in so many areas, in morals and values and in technology. Like today, what a disgrace, a big blot on the great USA.
uh, I share your sympathies in this respect.
All right then, bye.
Thank you so much.